Hi there, everybody.
Hello. We should have Emil coming in as well, if I understood things correctly.
Okay, cool.
So Andrea would be late, it looks like.
Yes.
Yep. Should we get started, or are we waiting for somebody?
I guess we can start.
Yeah.
Who's driving this? Who's willing to share some ideas or start a discussion? I don't really have any.
Yeah.
If you have something, Eric.
No, we had two items that we discussed, one from a previous meeting and one from the last SIG meeting. And we can start with the SIG meeting one, I think, which is, so on the SIG meeting, it was sort of decided that sometime in the January-February timeframe, we will make a push outwards from the SIG, as it was identified as a focus area from Linux Foundation meeting, something. Steve was there, he knows more. But the question I think we should discuss a bit is, what do we want to have in place when we do that push? So try to define something reasonable, but perhaps more than what we have today, and set January, February as a deadline for that increased scope.
Yeah, so my thoughts on, oh, let me back up. My kind of vision on how events is going to be successful is if we are able to get concrete use cases on how people are using tools and how they're trying to connect them together. You know, so the one thing that's happened over the last 10 years is not everybody's been standardizing on a single tool for CI/CD across the whole organization from dev to production. So there's gonna be a mix of tools, and I think we should reach out. And if this may be just what the what January, February we do is try to get these use cases out there and kind of put a box around them. So like you said, we don't want the scope to be too huge, but also I think we need to do some fact finding to find out where we need to head next. Because if we're able to get 3 or 4 good use cases, we should be able to see the pattern between those 3 or 4 use cases and where we need to focus a core set of events to build out from. That's just my view of how we should approach this. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
I think it makes really good sense, and presenting actual use cases where we have gotten something working is of course going to be powerful in a way that presenting a specification will not be on its own.
And I think if we have the use cases, it'll help drive what we need to put into the specification. If we don't, I think we'll just create a bunch of extra work for ourselves and create a bunch of stuff in the specification that may not be quite right. And then we go off and code it and waste time and have to go back and rework it. That's what I'm worried about.
I guess when we pick those use cases, we would I'm not thinking about, probably we should pick 3 or 4 quite different use cases, but also, I mean, there are, I believe, projects that aim to reach some sort of agnosticism or whatever you want to call it towards several event producers like Argo, or sorry, Argo would be one of those examples, I think. So we don't just like say, oh, here is something you can do with our spec, and people's response will be, well, we can already do that with Argo.
Right.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Captain. You know, Captain has their set of core events that are out there, and Jenkins is coming along with theirs. So that's why I'm kind of thinking of it from a end user's perspective, where I want to develop a pipeline and I want to hook together, you know, a Docker build, then some signature to the Docker image, and then I want to do some testing, and then I want to go ahead and deploy it, and then maybe, you know, have an approval gate. Something like that would be something, would be like one of the a use case, you know, something along those lines where, you know, the Docker build may be happening with Jenkins, and same with the signature. The deploy may be happening with Argo, and then the approval being done with Captain. You know, we're going to have these, you know, one of our goals in the events is to kind of hook together dispersed tools in a common language. And that's just a small example. And I know, you know, our POC already does some of this. I'm just saying that we can take it to the next level of introducing, you know, SNCC, or, you know, as part of the security scan, policy management on how to deal with the pipeline. You know, so there's a whole wide range of things in the use case, but I think we need to kind of find out what people are doing. And I know, Tracy, you mentioned this is kind of a competition that you've talked about in the past, like bring us your pipeline world, you know, submit your pipeline so we can see what you have going on. And that's kind of what I see in our next steps between now and like January, is to gather this information about people's pipelines, and then that's going to help us drive the vocabulary.
Yeah, I think already in this forum, we probably have multiple different domains of pipelines. So I would be coming from the automotive industry, where a pipeline would look very different from something that deploys to like a web service or something like that. So we can probably dig up some interesting things there.
Exactly. I know if we weren't able to find people, we can, you know, reach inside of our own organizations and come up with something. But it'd be interesting to find out. I know, like, I think it was Fidelity is coming on board with the CD Foundation. It'd be interesting to find out what they have going on. And I believe, what's the other one? Capital One as well.
Well, I'm not sure if Capital One is still around. I don't know who the end users are now. I know that's a focus for Tracy Miranda. She wants to bring on more and more end users, but I'm not sure who is. I know Fidelity is, because they are, maybe they're using Screwdriver.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what I mean. And I know Kara's talking with Fidelity because they want to bring on a couple some of their open source projects into the CD Foundation. So they may be a new active end user / contributor role.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But Cara would be the person that we would need to reach out to have those, to see if we can bring in the end users, because that's what she was sort of her focus.
Yeah. But that's just overall, that's my thought process around the January, February. I don't know if that makes sense for us to use that approach, or if go ahead, tweak it if you want, or throw it out.
I really like it. I think trying to quite quickly find a couple of interesting pipeline types or pipeline categories, and just using that to drive the vocabulary, I think is a really good idea.
And I think we should, like you're saying, put a box around it. So if somebody comes to us with some of these Jenkins pipelines can be overly complicated, where they have literally 30 different steps in their pipeline. And they're getting to a point where they're hard to maintain, that there may be, that would be a great pipeline for us to look at and go, well, we're going to pick X, Y, and Z out of this and focus on that, because X, Y, and Z is overlapping with another company's pipeline, and we can focus on those common pieces as extending the vocabulary into.
So in these use cases, to what extent would we get away with just drawing sequence diagrams and saying, here, this message would be sent and would be picked up with this? And to what extent do we actually have to implement support in these various tools for sending or receiving CD events messages? I guess a combination of the two might be okay.
Yeah, my view would be that we would, like you said, diagram it out. And then once we diagram it out, that could be part of the presentation and the outreach that we do in January, February, is showing these are 5 pipelines that we've gathered from just as a small sample. Here's where our current vocabulary set is, and here's our proposed next step, kind of like our roadmap for the next step of the vocabulary that's going to tackle these pieces of these parts of the pipeline. And then from there, depending on the tools and how much control we have over them, we may or may not be able to do some implementation around it. And we may need to reach out to folks like at Screwdriver, saying, we have, one of your largest customers, X, Y, and Z, or let's say Yahoo, is doing this, and we really want you to adopt some events around that, and see if we can get that project to move along with the implementation of that part of the vocabulary. Now things that are closer to home, like Tecton and Kepton and I don't know if we really have maybe Argo, but those events as well are a little bit closer to home, that we can have a little more control over and do some more coding around those as well, and on the Jenkins side as part of that process. So I think, like you said, Eric, there's going to be a mix. Some of it will be, this is what the new vocabulary, and this is what we need these other projects to start implementing, and this is how you do it. And then things that we can do ourselves, we can tackle on our own and kind of expand out the SDK around that.
Yes. Does this approach sound okay with everyone else? Find 3 or 4 use cases and go from there to diagram out the flows and work on the vocabulary based on that?
If we
It sounds
can.
great from me, yeah. I like it really.
Yeah, I think if we can do that, it's worth it.
And I think, of course, it would make a better business case for us when we see that these are things that users are actually requesting and would actually use. I mean, not just inventing some events because we
Right.
want or whatever. We need to have it tied to some real world use cases that people will use.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
Yes, I agree. If you can get some real life pipelines or use cases, that's for sure a great plus. I think there are still some areas even from the POC that we can still work on. Like for the POC to get Tecton and Kepton working together, we have to do some kind of hacks to get the right context traveling around so that, you know, they would really understand each other. So there are some areas of the protocol that we can try to work on, even from the original POC. But yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't think we should stop working and wait for use cases to come in. Definitely keep on building out from the knowledge that we have.
Yeah, I was about to say that as well, because I think, of course, we should have the use cases in place for January, February, but we should also have should have come some way, I mean, with the actual protocol itself as well. I mean, we have quite a lot of discussions right now in GitHub, and we should try to sort some of those out. And I guess we should look into what discussions are more important than others to start with and to get done. So we get the basics in place somehow.
Yep.
We need to show also that we have something. I mean, we have the POC, but it was quite quickly just set up. And now we are discussing more core parts of the actual events and their definitions. So we should look into those as well.
Totally agree.
Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Andre.
I was going to say another area that I think it's important to cover, or at least have some story around it, is the fact that I guess the main objection I get to events are like visibility of the overall workflow. If you have a workflow which is distributed and you have one piece sending an event and another piece, and how do you get the overall view? And the other thing is with the security, with the supply chain security being so like a focus of attention now. What about attestations? So if you have your pipeline that is divided across multiple parts, how do you get the attestation with everything that happened, you know, across the different platforms? And I think actually having a common protocols can help for both, because this is already the case that the pipeline is spread across platforms, because we use GitHub for SCM or GitLab, and then we have something for building and something else for deploying often. But having like common semantics can help us like building a better visibility into the pipeline and creating like collating maybe attestation from different platforms. But I think we need to have a stronger or more clear story around that. In the POC, we had this like box in the bottom about like monitoring, viewing pipelines and so forth. And I think it would be good to have a good story in that part as well. I think that's an important part for me as well.
Is there an existing project out there that will be a dashboard for cloud events?
Nothing serious that I could find. I mean, there is for the POC, I use the cloud events player, which is just showing you the list of cloud events. But it would be nice to have something that, you know, gets the timestamps and the type of activity, looks into whatever context information we provide and gives you an overview. Right, and if we define the ability to have links to artifacts like we discussed last time, you could then build tools that also go and fetch the various artifacts. If you have links to SBOMs or attestations, you could have a tool that goes and fetches all the attestation for the different parts and collates them together, for instance. I'm not, these are kind of random ideas, not maybe well thought through, but I think it's an area that it's important to explore.
Yeah, I wonder if Captain or Argo would have something that we could, I know they don't talk cloud events, but I wonder if we can kind of grab parts of their UI, you know, the visualization part, and kind of strip out their events and plug in our events.
But isn't something quite similar done today with the POC? I mean, you can actually see the, can't you see all the results of the POC in the Captain interface?
Yeah, you can see the sequence that you define on Captain side, and the thing is with Captain you can define your sequence of your environments and your sequence of things that should happen in your pipeline, and then Captain delegates the actual execution to external tools, right? And it does that through events, and in the POC it sends events, and then Tecton runs the deployment, for instance, and then Captain gets the event back, and then on the UI it marks, okay, deployment is done, and it gives you the SHA of the image that was used for the deployment and everything. So in a sense that's correct, but it also true that it's a bit of cheating with Captain, because you need to know what are the stages of your deployment in advance. You cannot get a list of events and like visualize what you have without you need to have the kind of static definition of what is going to happen, what are the stages in advance.
Yeah, and that's kind of, like you said, kind of cheating, because the idea behind events is, being able to connect anything to anything and not really have to rely on like a predefined stages.
Right, and if I think of the Fedora use case that was presented to this group, I mean, where they use events and they have like hundreds of packages running their CI and then sending messages to like a central system saying, okay, yeah, it went well. You cannot define in advance what you expect, because then every package would have to go to the central system and say, oh yeah, I'm also going to run this test now. And that kind of breaks the purpose.
Well, the one idea that I have, and I can't remember which tool does this, but it may be Dynatrace, but we could kind of do like you said, the timestamp, and kind of have like a sliding time scale, and then that's gonna be on your horizontal axis, and then on your vertical axis would be the different events that are kind of occurring. So you can kind of look at this time, this triggered at this level. Just an idea. I'd have to look at the graphing packages to see if we can make that data make sense, or we kind of do a time scale, and then we kind of connect the boxes as we go, saying that this sent this event from GitHub, sent an event over to Captain, for example, and at 12 o'clock was the GitHub event, then 12:01 was the Captain received it, and kind of do a sliding scale of a moving graph, so you can kind of see how things are evolving over time. So a combination of those may be an easy way to hook together into a visualization that shouldn't take that much, a huge amount of coding, because there's a lot of graphing packages out there that do a lot of the work, for the layout wise. We just got to get the data in there correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we need to have in the protocol the right information that help us correlate the event and say this kind of that they belong together, right? So this was the initial event, this is and because they come from different systems, so we need to have some rules in the protocol so that if you receive an event and then you send an event, that you need to kind of transport some of the information from the source event into the new events that you're creating, so that you can have this correlation.
Yeah, that was one of the, do we in the protocol have a history chain of all the events?
We don't right now, but it's something that we'll have to design some kind of mechanism for that. I guess I was looking at how distributed tracing works.
Yeah.
A bit. And so we might be able to use a similar type of approach instead of reinventing the wheel. And I think Highfill has support for ordering of events, but I think those are generated by a single system. So I don't know, in a distributed system, so with different platforms, how that works.
So in iFull, it is we link between events. So that would be the linking thing, that you actually link. If you have one event and you have a next event, then you give a link to the previous event, so you can traverse the links.
Right, but to do that, the events have to be persisted somewhere, right?
Yeah, if you run a search backwards, of course, if you listen to all events right away, then if you receive an event, you're gonna know, okay.
Oh, yeah. So if we have a master listener that's listening to all events, then you can trace back through the link chain.
Yeah.
Okay. And then that master listener can decide whether it wants to persist all the events or just cache them in memory.
Yeah, I guess so.
I guess from an audit perspective, kind of like on the supply chain, you'd want to persist that.
And when it comes to graphing libraries, I pasted in the chat there. There is something called Vis.js that
Yeah,
has this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So it's examples of doing it, and it seems quite simple to actually get up and show one of those. So that's just an idea, but that is a graph that you're drawing, and then we kind of like need relationships between events in some kind of way.
Yeah. And the other one I use is this one. It's D3 is the other one. So Viz.js and D3 are the two primary open source ones that I've used. Because we deal with graphing all the time in Deploy Hub and Ortelius. So but those are the two packages that both of those libraries, you know, most of these libraries are pretty simple to use. It's just a matter of getting the data into them, and that's usually pretty easy. Okay. So it sounds like we have our work cut out. One on the well, in 3 areas, one being the or 4 areas, one being the visualization of events and event history, the security around events between dispersed systems, the extending the rounding out the POC vocabulary as part of that, and there was a 4th one I just can't think of off the top of my head. But that's kind of what I kind of see what we have as our kind of to-do list. I'm missing one more, but I can't think of it right now.
Do we want to move the current repos that we have to the newly created GitHub organization before this push out?
I think we should. Let me put in the, I finished the, or I got a draft going for the proposal. So there's a pull request out there. Please comment on it and go ahead and change anything or whatever we need to do to round that out. But we would, I think next week is a CDF TOC meeting again. So I'd like to present the proposal to the CDF next week. I don't think we're gonna get much pushback, so I think it's more of a formality from what I can tell.
That sounds very good that we bring it up on TLC, and we have the SIG Events meeting right on Monday before that. So I guess we can finish it by then and have the final discussions if it's not already approved by then.
Yep. So please comment on that pull request and I will update whatever we need to make on that.
So I will need to drop off, unfortunately, now for a private appointment. So thanks for this discussion today, and hope we get somewhere more during the next half an hour.
We'll get there.
Yeah, thank you. Talk to you. Bye.
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 So on the POC and the Andre, you're saying that we have some of the events there that we need to kind of clean up. Is that something that we need to discuss, or is it more of like a coding implementation thing?
No, I think we need to agree on a mechanism that we can transport context that system might need, or if you want to do that. What I mean is that in the POC, because Captain is acting as an orchestrator, it sets its context ID, and then Tecton receives it, and then Captain expects to have it back in the events, right? To close the loop and to do the right visualization.
Right.
And for that to work, we have some specific code on Tecton side that picks, so some code on the Captain adapter that takes the context and put it into the event, and then some code on Tecton side that gets this information from the body of the event and then stores it and then sends it back at the end of the pipeline. And then on the receiving side on Captain, again, we need to get this information out of the event into the place where Captain expects it.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, one part of the solution could be on Captain's side, if Captain spoke those events kind of natively, that would set the context in the right place, and they could get the context on the right place. But we need to have a place where to store this kind of information, and it could be like an extension field where application puts some data that they need. But we need also to be able to express to the receiving side that please forward this data when you send other messages. And I don't know, it's an extra use case. I mean, it's useful for the POC. I don't know if that's a specific use case that we want to focus from the beginning to being able to carry this context, application specific context back. For sure, I would like to for sure to be able to have like a history like we were discussing earlier, so that we can build the sequence or the graph of events.
Yeah. So when I was talking to one of the women that was running Google Docs, she was explaining the Google's event processing. And one of the things that Google did was they would add data, contextual data to the event. And if you didn't need it, you ignored it. So it was kind of like an ignore process. So the event payload ended up getting bigger as it went through. But what ended up happening was you had the contextual data that you needed to, to get back, like you said, to close the loop as part of that. And I'm wondering if we need to kind of implement that with a mix with the history chain, possibly, where each event would add to the history of the event its own contextual data element as part of that. So you can go back and close the loop, because I can see when we start crossing, you know, just for example, if you want to, let's say you have Jenkins and Captain and Tecton, and you want to, Jenkins started the build and you wanted to loop back around to the, after going through, you know, the other couple events, that you wanted to send something back to Jenkins, that you're going to need like the build ID or some contextual reference way back at the start of Jenkins. And if you look at even Jira, if Jira was involved in the process, you have a Jira ticket and you want to update a status on the Jira side, that you're
Right.
going to have this contextual stuff across multiple tools.
Right.
And they're going to
Yeah.
have their own reference.
Right. That even with GitHub, you will have the node ID. So that is the PR where you start from or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But are you
So
thinking that you should add on that contextual information in the event? So if you're having like Jira, Jenkins, and so on and so on, would all of those contexts be part of the message that will, like, so it will grow larger and larger?
I think you're going to have to, if you don't have an event listener that you can go ask questions to. So, you know, so that's one way to do it. The other way is to have an event listener that's monitoring all the events and kind of keeping track of them. So when I need to go close the loop for Captain, I can say, give me the history of this event, and I can go get a list and say, oh, I need to go now focus on the Captain update, for example, or whatever, that I can get to that at that layer. So I think we have kind of two choices. One is to let the payload grow, and the other one is to keep the payload small but persist all the chain somewhere else that we can go make inquiries about.
So kind of my maybe it's a naive reading of the cloud event spec was kind of a recommendation of not having big events in that case, but maybe not building on, but finding it out somewhere else. But then I'm also colored by AFL, of course, where we also have smaller events, and then we use links to traverse back to find the information.
Yeah, and if you're gonna, if you have the links to traverse backwards, if you want to, you know, if my event right now has a link to the previous one, let's say GitHub, that if I want to now traverse back to GitHub, and now I have the information about the GitHub and GitHub's previous event, where is that information persisted? Because that transaction's already ended. So I have to go query something to find out more information about the previous event for the GitHub, which could be a PR merge or something like that. So there's, you know, even if we do the event chain, we have to be able to go ask something about the information about, you know, going all the way back through history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think I get what you're talking about, but then I guess it's about how much information we want to put in the events as such. When we had the like the pre-spec or what I call it, we talked about, for example, having branches being created, pull requests being updated, and so on. So maybe all of those events might contain all the information, but then of course there will always be information that might not contain it, but maybe we can cover the majority of use cases, but just looking at the events.
Well, to kind of solve the problem that Andre was talking about, being able to have the context ID or whatever it was called for Captain to be able to close the loop, even though it's a small amount of information, we have to have access to that to be able to, as part of the history chain, to be able to kind of build that closing of the loop process. So we have to be able to somehow, either we pass that along as the payload data, or we go to previous events till we get back to where we came from, to get that Captain context ID.
So one thing when it comes with adding information in events, keeping on, that would be, for example, if you have a pretty big CI engine where you have a bunch of different pipelines that is like converging. So for example, you have like if you would have 100 different components that would build up to one big component, would you then aggregate all of these information in events that going forward? In that case, it would be quite much information. So
I think you'd have to.
And that is kind of like at least in my head, a little bit of concern about the kind of size events would get if you would have to pull in all that data inside an event.
Yes, I totally agree that the payload could get very big at that point. And like you said, around the cloud events, trying to keep the payload small, that if you just reference your previous event, and then, like I said, in order to reference anything happened before you have to persist the events somewhere in order to find out those payload bodies for every event, which kind of comes into like what you're saying, Andre, with the visualization. You can, if you have more data, if you have the payloads persisted, you can do some really nice graphing with some really nice details of what's happening, because you're going to have access to the payload information.
Yeah.
So do you guys think that keeping the event payload small is a higher priority than, or is one of our goals that we should take to create a solution where we keep the cloud event payload small, is the way we should focus, or should we let the payload grow?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm wondering whether we could have multiple options. In certain use cases, you don't need the loop back. You just want to, like, if I'm sending an event for letting anyone know that my build is complete, and someone might pick up that event and send notifications and do some things based on that. You don't really need to go back to the source and say, yes, I sent this notification and I did that, because that's not what you're trying to do. So, and I think for that kind of scenarios, having small events and light events is enough. might need to have some context still, but not the entire chain. So if you have some context, you can still say, okay, find out that certain notification were sent for this event if you want to know that afterwards, but you don't need to have the whole story in every event. So maybe it could be one option in the protocol. Let's say if you want to use the protocol for a kind of like a asynchronous call and response, remote call and response, then you need to enable this full sequence history. Maybe it's an option that you can set in the event, and then the receiver might honor that or not.
Yeah, because it does make it interesting when you look at where does the event chain start? You know, does it start at GitHub, or could it be something back in like Jira, which would be like a user story getting marked for something? You know, who is the starter of it? Because if we could figure out who the starter is, then you can assign an event ID that would be long living across all the events. That as you go from event to event, you still have the starting event ID, and that you can hook into your context. Because like on the Kepton side, if Kepton was truly doing event broadcasting and listening, and you had a master event ID, it could then look up internally to say, oh, this was the master event ID I sent out this event for, even though the event could be like a unit test event. You know, you still have the master event ID, and then you have another event ID for the unit test event. As you come back to close the unit test event, you can, that message being broadcast back would have the master event ID in it as well. And then it can look up internally to say, oh, I need to close the loop on this unit test event as part of it. Does that make sense? Where you kind of have a way to keep track of events, and as you do a broadcast listen type of world, you can look up internally if you're looking to close something from another event coming back in. But in order to do that, you have to figure out who's the beginning of it all.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can make assumptions on who's the beginning. I mean, and it can also become a little bit philosophical, I guess, who started the whole chain.
Yes.
Because,
and especially when you talk about time lapses, because you could have something an event that occurred 2 weeks ago that is finally going to get acted upon.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think I mean, you could have a notification sent to Slack that triggers an engineer to say, oh, there is a problem here, and then going to create an issue for that, and then I mean, there is always a chain of event, but I don't think we can find the really the
beginning of time for an event.
Yeah. That's why I think in the very beginning, I was saying maybe the fact of having the loop and closing the loop is a kind of a separate problem. So we could say we have kind of two different ways of using events. One is kind of the decoupled way, where you send the event and then you kind of forget about it. You don't expect something coming back. And then we have the more complex scenario, which is the one that we set up in the POC, where you expect to have something, or that you might have something back and wait for a response. And that's kind of an RPC, but it's distributed, so time, if you will. And we could consider that a different way, a different way of using the protocol, or if you're a different, and that like dedicated design for that. So it seems to be a rather complex problem. So I'm not sure. Maybe we could try and set up for the next POC a scenario where we don't hit that particular issue and focus on that, because it's maybe the easier, and there are still quite a few things to design there, I think, and then we could come back to the one where we need the context to come back.
Right.
I don't know. That's just.
I think I think that makes a lot of sense to split it between the two, the easy problem and the complex problem.
So when we're having this discussion, I don't know, I'm looking back to the idea of having pipelines described. Would it help us if we came, because what you're describing now is kind of like a general problem. So for example, if we would jot down a couple of example of pipelines, and we would discuss around those pipelines, would that help in the discussion?
When you talk about a pipeline, you definitely have a starting point. So that does put some, you know where you're starting, so you can always grab information and persist information from your starting point all the way through to the completion. So it's very linear. And I think that's what kind of has been achieved in the POC already. But I think we do need to look at more of a dynamic event model.
So maybe we need to, like, would it be helpful if we draw down the scenarios? So we had a bunch of scenarios there, so we can take a look at those. Because then you can maybe have questions around it or grasp it a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. And that's the idea why I was talking about the 3 to 4 use cases to around pipelines, so we can kind of solve real world problems instead of philosophical ones.
Yeah, I was trying to loop back to that one. So yeah, that sounds a good one, because I mean, when I'm hearing this with going back to the source, I'm thinking of, okay, what happens if you have 2 different components that's gonna be, you need two libraries for building your project, which is the start in that case, and so on. So there's a lot of questions. So maybe that's easier to see when you have a picture in front of you.
Yeah, and I think the scenario that you're talking about is if you have 100 microservices that are all being built independently and they have their own event world happening, and but then you need to consolidate into kind of have all these events funnel into one before you can move on to the next bigger event or consolidate event. You know, like for like an example, you do all these builds in parallel, and then you want to go ahead and deploy at that. After all those have been completed, then you can go ahead and do a deploy event that would then also then trigger out a massive parallel deployment. You know, so I think we're going to have this, the consolidation is going to come into play.
Yeah, and maybe also you probably would be quite easy to find. For example, if you take a JavaScript library or something and try to map out the dependencies between it. So for example, if you have a library and then you say, okay, which ones are you dependent on, and dependence on dependence on dependence, and try to like draw that tree, you would probably also have a kind of like a situation where it's, you could take a look at it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're doing on the Ortelius side, is looking at those relationships and tracking those dependencies at that level. So we'll track them. Ortelius is persisting those relationships, like you said, at that level, then also at a higher level as let's say you take an npm Docker, a Node.js Docker image, it's going to have its 1,000 dependencies in it, but then that is going to create a service that's going to perform a certain RESTful API endpoint. And then those are then packaged together. Those microservices are then packaged together at a higher level to create a runnable application. So from the Ortiz perspective, we're persisting those relationships, but we're not, at the current time, we don't have an event listener letting us know that everything's been built and packaged. But that's one of the things that from the Ortiz side, the events that we're going to be looking at are going to be ones around those as well.
Okay, sounds interesting. So maybe it makes sense to have one of these use case pipelines having Ortelius in the part of this story as well, because it would be a good consumer of events.
Yes, definitely. And we're working on that from our side. We're doing a GitOps world, how Captain, Argo, and Ortelius are working together to perform a GitOps model for deployment and tracking what's been deployed where. And we want to do that event based as well to make sure that the vocabulary is there for one of those use cases. So I can bring that. We're about 90% done with that process.
You mean would you like to do a presentation on that? Maybe one of the.
Yeah, I can do one. Yeah, I can do that. I don't know if we want to do it. Let's see where we're at next week to if we want to do it that one or if we want to do it the vocabulary one. Either way.
Okay.
I got to jump off for another call. So
We're about the time as well, so I think we could close it here for today.
yep, put your thinking caps on about the event chains. It's a complex issue.
Yeah. All right. Good discussions today, everyone.
All right, everybody take
Have a
care.
good day. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.